Carissa, welcome to Podcastina.
Galina, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Thanks so much for coming. People talk about being self aware. What are the telltale signs that someone is lacking self awareness?
Oh, goodness gracious. How much time do we have for that one? Um, I think it's really interesting, and maybe I'll take it in kind of a read between the lines sort of definition. I think what's really interesting is a lot of times people think they're self-aware when they say, "Oh, I know what I'm good at. I understand my strengths, my weaknesses, and I can totally speak to those things." When it comes to my accomplishments, the things I'm good at. And so I think for me, the true sign is of lacking self-awareness is also this gap between what I call cognitive awareness and embodied awareness. And so I was like this for a long time, so that's why I can recognize it now because I lived in this version. So that's not a judgment on anyone because I think it's part of the journey and it's necessary. But it's this idea that because we live in a society that glorifies, I think, therefore I am. We think that everything happens in the mind. And so when we, for instance, I'll use the classic example of when we say we want to work out more or we want to get fit, but then we don't follow through. That's usually a sign that there's some sort of gap in our awareness because our spoken values, the things we say we want, the things we say we want to accomplish, we're not following through on that. So that means that we have the awareness, in the realm of fitness. We know why working out or eating healthier is good for us. We have the cognitive knowledge that we need. And if that was all that mattered, then we'd all, be doing exactly what we wanted. We'd be completely motivated all of the time. But it's really that sign. So I would say, to answer your question, the sign of lacking that self-awareness is if we say we want something and we can identify in our own lives there's a gap between what we're saying and what we're actually doing and following through. There's usually something really rich in the in between there.
Follow the information that we're getting, follow the gap.
Exactly, exactly.
I love that it can be referred to as two, not that they're not intertwined, but I appreciate the separation of the awareness, the cognitive awareness versus bodily awareness. Cause I feel like on my own journey with healing, if you want to call it, I feel like it's so cliche to be like, I'm on my healing journey. But honestly, it was, when I think of it that way, there's two different points at which I had cognitive awareness and then I had bodily awareness. And the bodily awareness is really only a very, very recent addition to my arsenal, where I just recently started realizing that crying is a mechanism to process my emotions, to digest my emotions, the same way that I digest food. And not to get disgusting, but you wouldn't hold your poo in. So don't hold your tears in either.
I love that. That's so good. I'm going to start using that one. That's so good. It's really valuable because I think it's about translating these concepts into things that we can understand, right? And many of us have been taught for years or even our whole lives that showing emotion is a bad thing. If we identify as men, then anger is like the only acceptable emotion, and if we identify as women, it's like, oh, we don't want to be a basket case. We don't want people to ask us, oh, is it that time of the month, or something like that. So the idea of expressing our emotions has this pejorative connotation no matter how we identify. And so yeah, I really love that. Allow it to digest, allow it to pass through, and then don't hold on to it, because I think that's the really operative part of it. I used to get stuck in my emotions, right? This wave of sadness or frustration or anger would come over me and I would start to spiral into the stories. And then I would, oh, the evening's ruined, the weekend's ruined, whatever it is. But allowing it to pass through just like a wave and then let go, because we're not meant to hold on to those emotions, just like we're not meant to hold on to our poo. Just let it go.
Can you tell if someone's holding on to something for a long time? If, let's say, a minor infraction happens to you relationally, let's say your partner forgets to do the dishes, you've talked about the dishes many times, it's kind of a recurring button for you. What's an appropriate length of time to let that trigger really sit and to have a reaction about it? Like, where is the line between, okay, appropriate reaction, now you're dwelling?
Great question. I love that so much. That's something I work with my coaching clients on is what I call is finding the tipping point. So I would say that, the short answer is it's not the same for everyone, but what I would encourage is it's about finding that tipping point where it goes from serving you to no longer serving you. So for instance, we've talked to our partner, and even the fact that we're having, let's say, an outsized reaction about something, if it feels like, wow, I feel really intense emotions around this, that's usually a sign in and of itself that we haven't been taking care of it in the past. If my partner, we use dishes as the example, right? My partner, for instance, we have a little sponge holder in the sink, and oftentimes when he does the dishes, he puts the sponge somewhere other than the sponge holder on the sink, and I see it, and my first thought is like, it lives right there. Like, it's like, why wouldn't you just put it right there? And if I allow that to kind of build the energy, then I might have an outburst at him and say something like, gosh, don't you know where the sponge lives, right? But that's because I've been allowing the energy to build until it's kind of like that pressure cooker, right? Of like blowing off steam. So instead, I keep it from getting to that point by reframing it and saying, my partner did the dishes. How beautiful and lovely is that? And it takes me 1 second to put the sponge back where it belongs. And so I think about that a lot in terms of our ability to reframe. And so if we have this issue that is building and we notice that our reaction to it is becoming stronger and stronger, that's usually a sign that we haven't been addressing it. We haven't been, and I'll use the language of internal family systems, like we haven't been taking care of that part of us that's feeling unseen, that's feeling invalidated in some way. And so when it comes to what's the appropriate amount of time, I think part of it is it depends on how long we've been neglecting or abandoning that part of ourselves, and what kind of repair work is needed to get back to integrity within ourselves. So that could be 5 minutes, it could be 5 hours, it could be 5 days. It really depends on how long we've been ignoring that part of us. But it's really about, if we get into the dwelling space, that's where we can also get into, let's say, the victim mindset. Woe is me, right? Like, oh, my life is so hard. No one knows what a terrible partner I have. When we start making up stories about the person or about the relationship that aren't just about that instance, that's usually a sign that we're taking it too far. Oh, because of this one thing that happened, they never do this. They always do that. I'll never have this type of partnership. So when we start extrapolating the story, that's usually a sign that there's some work that needs to be done.
Excellent. It's a good metric, I think, for people to understand of, oh, my overreaction perhaps is not in fact about the dishes.
Exactly. And that's where I think it's also about tweaking the language, right? Because even you just said it, overreaction, right? That tends to carry some judgment with it of like, oh, I'm overreacting.
Mm.
And what I like to say is every reaction is appropriately sized, because it's basically the data that our body is giving us to say, for instance, if you're having a conversation with someone and they're ignoring you, our tendency is to increase the volume at which we're speaking, right? If I'm like, hey, Galina, I want to say something to you, and you're just going about your day, you're not listening, I'm probably going to raise my voice and say, hey, Galina, I need your attention. And so that's how I like to think of it, as the data signals from our body. If we've been ignoring that part of ourselves for a long time, it can feel like an overreaction. We use that term, but it's because that part of ourself is finally waving the flag, like, stop ignoring me. I need some attention here.
How do I raise my self-awareness?
Mm. I think for me, a lot of it is coming from noticing that place of judgment, right? Of, oh, I'm overreacting or downplaying, right? We tend to gaslight ourselves a lot, like,
Oh, yeah.
oh, this isn't that big of a deal. I shouldn't be feeling this way. And so we tend to sort of hold ourselves to a standard of how we were taught by our family, by society, by whomever, whatever stories we internalized about what is appropriate and what perfect looks like or anything like this, how we should show up in order to earn love, affection, attention, belonging, whatever it is that we're going for. And so if we can sit with that judgment and flip it into curiosity, that's a really great gateway to increasing our self-awareness. just asking ourselves a question, if we have a judgment, I shouldn't be feeling this way, just inserting a question. Who says? Who made me believe that I shouldn't feel a certain way? Or who made me believe that my emotions were too big or they didn't deserve to be felt? So just getting curious about the origin of the judgments and where those come from can really, if we're willing to sort of pull on that thread and go down the rabbit hole, if you will, it can lead us to a lot of really good insight, because oftentimes these stories, these patterns that we exhibit in our brains, I call them the neural superhighways, right? A lot of people, we talk about these pathways. And if you look at a road that gets traveled frequently, you've got multiple lanes going both directions. You've got the lights, you've got, everything you could need to make it feel safe to travel down this road. And when you want to start going down a different road, it might look, I like to use the analogy of the Beauty and the Beast. If you ever saw the old Disney movie, where you have the fork in the road, and one path looks bright and sunny and welcoming, and the other one looks kind of dark and scary and shadowy. Something that's unknown is going to look dark and scary. So if we can think about curiosity as sort of taking a candle on that dark path, like, well, tell me more. What makes me believe this? Then that's how we can start to light up a path that maybe we haven't been traveling down very often. And it can make it feel less scary if we can really tap into that curiosity.
It's a really relaxing way. I don't know why that word just comes to me of the analogy you just used. It doesn't have to be a dark alley. It can just be something I haven't looked at before. And I do a lot of without crossing into too much woo-woo territory, but manifesting work, which is ultimately just mindset work. And so much of that comes from, similarly to what you're talking about, what's at the root of the belief? Like, where's that self-belief? I don't deserve to have anger about this situation. I don't deserve to be so upset about this. And kind of that like almost second tier of emotions where it's like, oh, I feel bad. I'll use this as an example. I'm in Los Angeles and I was not personally impacted by the fires, but I was so devastated, right? For just weeks on end. And it turned into this guilt trip of how dare I be devastated when I didn't lose anything.
Mm. Oh my gosh, that resonates so deeply with me, Galina. Thinking about a lot of, I'll say, the social justice events happening in the US over the last several years, and the Black Lives Matter movement. um, that was definitely a mindset that I got into, was who am I to have a voice? Who am I to have a perspective? Because I have such a tremendous amount of privilege to be in this body and to be living in this developed nation and all of that. And it really can be debilitating. So you talk about things that don't serve us, right? If I'm ruminating, if I'm spiraling into guilt, depression, if it's keeping me from taking action on what these emotions are asking me to do, then it's not serving me. And so, how do we really find that tipping point to say, that the guilt or the devastation that you are feeling as a result of the fires, that's an invitation from your body, maybe to get involved, right, with the community, or to see how you can help your friends who were impacted. All of these emotions are really data and invitations for us.
Do you think the prevalence of that kind of second tier emotion, like my guilt over the devastation, is that just an attempt to run away from the underlying feeling that the devastation is too uncomfortable? I don't want to feel it. So therefore, I'm talking myself out of it.
I think that's a really good point. I think that could definitely be, it depends on which direction the story goes. Um, but I also think there's so much, I'll call it the complaining Olympics that go on, right? Of like, who gets to feel the worst about this thing? And we have, especially in the US, and I would say a lot of Western nations, we have this scarcity mindset of only the people who are the best at something deserve to do it. Only the people who have it the worst deserve to feel bad about it. And we tend to think in really these binary terms, tapping into that binary bias that we evolved to have in our brains, where things, we try to categorize things as black and white. And so I think a lot of it comes down to that as well. There's absolutely the discomfort of the initial emotion, and we try to bypass, we try to diffuse it in some way by talking about it, by numbing it, by just shoving it into the shadow or the unconscious. There are a lot of, different ways that we might try to deal with it. But then I think those stories about, well, I don't deserve to feel this. It's because I'm not the most impacted. I don't deserve to go after my dreams because I'm not the best in the world at it. So there's a lot of that scarcity and competition that comes in as well.
I think that that's probably the root cause of it too. And it's almost this public attitude that any good feeling, whether we're looking at the devastation side of it or the accomplishments, the ambition side, ambition is not zero sum. Tragedy is not zero sum. Like people are allowed to have their moments with it. So I think that that's like right on the money of just trying to unravel away from it and realize no, you those people that are the best in their industry, they became that way by sucking at first.
Exactly, exactly. And this idea of like, yeah, the tragedy Olympics, right? And it's like there's only a sample size of one inside of our bodies. And so I can't know and fully experience everything that you've experienced in your life and your body because that's not me. And the idea of discounting what you're feeling because I have it worse, there's really no way to compare those things. And that I think leads to a lot of isolation because then we don't come forward, we don't communicate about it, we don't ask for support, we don't talk to people. Whereas there's a really beautiful opportunity to say, okay, Galina, tell me about the hardest thing you've experienced. Then that's where empathy, compassion can really come in. And I can say, maybe I haven't experienced those exact circumstances, but what I can do is I can tap into the hardest experience I've had and we can find common ground. We can find there's actually a lot more that brings us together than what separates us. So if we use ambition as inspiration rather than comparison, if we use tragedy as an opportunity to be supported rather than to try to compete with someone, there's a lot of opportunity for connection that we're missing out on in those experiences.
Amazing. Do you watch any of the Housewives at all? And I swear this is relevant.
I don't, but tell me more.
Because I was just going to maybe use one of them as an example, but everybody's got folks in their lives. And for me, it's easy to just point to some of the housewives and be like, okay, this person is the peak of unself aware, right? Like lacking self awareness. But everybody's got somebody in their life, maybe in their circle, maybe in their family, maybe under the same roof as them, who's painfully unaware. How should we approach a person who is super unaware? Like, what are some of the common obstacles with these people, and how do we get through to them?
Hmm. It's a really beautiful question. It was relevant, so I'm glad you brought it up. Uh, you know, it's a tough answer because what I would say is maybe we're not meant to get through to them.
Mm.
Instead, I think there's an opportunity to see every single person as a mirror. So when I think about, because I definitely, would used to judge like, oh, that person's so they're not self-aware, they're not walking the talk, whatever it is. And that was an invitation. It didn't require, but it was an invitation I chose to accept to say, what is it about that bugs me so much? Oh, shoot. That's because there are these areas in my life where I'm not walking the talk, where maybe I'm not as aware as I think I am or would like to be. And so when it comes to, how do I get through to them? How do I help them? Whatever it is, I would say stop trying to do that. Stop making that the goal because what I have found in my own experiences, I used to want, and I did it from a very noble place, right? In my mind, it was like, oh, I want to help people. I really want to support people. And I heard this phrase years ago as I was really learning a lot about the social justice movement of, when we want to help someone, it's actually a form of oppression, which that was mind blowing for me to hear because as I unraveled it, it's this idea that when we want to help someone, first and foremost, it shows that we don't trust them to help themselves. When we think we know better than what they know for themselves, that can be a form of oppression because we're creating a power imbalance here. We're putting ourselves in a higher power position and saying, oh, I know what you should do. I know what it is that you need, rather than saying, you know what, Galina, you've got all the resources. You're living your life. How do I support you in what it is that you're trying to accomplish? And trusting that maybe I can see it from a mile away, right? Maybe I see that it's a train wreck, but trusting that Maybe you need the train wreck in order to elevate your own awareness, in order to have the experience that you need, which does require letting go of a lot of judgment. But ultimately, seeing every single person as a mirror and as an invitation to say, okay, if I'm judging this about this other person, where am I judging that in myself? If I'm annoyed about this trait, where am I annoyed that I do the same thing? And there have been so many times where, it happened, just as a silly example. I was getting annoyed with someone on the road. I was driving, and I was sitting behind the same car through multiple stoplights, and I noticed that like at every single stoplight, it was taking them a good 15 or 20 seconds to go when the light turned green, because I assumed they were on their phone doing something. And I was just getting a little annoyed about that. And then like 5 minutes later, I was at a stoplight. I pulled out my phone, and then someone had to honk at me to go when the light turned green. And I was like, oh, full circle. Thank you for that reminder that we are all humans. We're all doing the best that we can. And what I ultimately want is for people to not feel that I'm judging them, that I'm trying to change or control them, but instead they see me doing my work of looking in the mirror. Maybe that will inspire them to also look in the mirror.
That resonates with me a lot. And I almost, not that I asked that question, like I wanted to get that exact answer, but I do 12 step in Al-Anon. And one
Mm-hmm.
of the things that they say that's very similar to that is give people the dignity to fall on their own face. And so I always kind of still bring that question into play a lot, because I think there's so much, and it's something I battle within myself, like just wanting to fix shit for somebody else, just wanting to get in there and be like, no, this is how it's done. No, this is how I load the dishwasher, whatever. I keep coming back to dishes. Like, no, this is how you stop having all these bad habits that are absolutely derailing you from your goals, that I can see how passionate you are about getting this done. And then like the execution and the follow through isn't there. But I think outside of being the example to those people, we can't hold their hand, right?
Well, and I think, I would ask the follow-up question, right? When you think about the experiences that have taught you the most, that have been the most impactful for you on your journey, was it because someone came and said, Galina, I know exactly what you need to do, and you were like, oh, okay, that made so much sense? Or did you have to have the experience for yourself?
It never came from anybody else. It was always just me having an epiphany of here's the thing that needs to be fixed.
Or falling on my face, and that taught me like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that anymore, maybe I need to learn from that. So I think that's the other part of it, is when we say we want to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, it's like, I love that, like, have the dignity to fall on their own face, and trust that the pain or the challenge, the adversity that they will face through that experience is exactly what they need for their next opportunity of growth or expansion. Just as I don't want people to hold back on that experience for me. Like, I don't want to walk around life with a bunch of safety nets all around me. It reminds me of, there's a quote from Finding Nemo. I love Pixar, but Marlin, the dad, for anyone who hasn't seen it, go watch Finding Nemo. At this point, it's old enough that everyone should have seen it. But Marlin and Dory are talking, and Marlin's like, "Oh, I promised I would never let anything happen to him." And Dory just says, "Well, that's a funny thing to promise, because then nothing would ever happen to him."
Wow. I've seen the movie and I forgot that quote. And now that we're talking about it in this context, it's so valuable.
Yeah, so I love that. So I think it's, letting go of that judgment, letting go of superiority, which I think can be really hard, because the way I think about it is, if we have this spectrum of belief, and I was talking to my therapist about this years ago, it was easier for me to let go of the idea that I wasn't better than anybody, but it was really hard for me to let go of the idea that nobody was better than me. I tended to put myself in this inferior position a lot, like a power under dynamic. And what I realized through that experience was, if we want to let go of a belief at one end of the spectrum, we need to set down the belief that's at the other end of the spectrum. We need to set the whole thing down. So I couldn't go around saying, I'm not better than anyone, and then also still believe that other people are better than me. And so I think there comes a time where we have to just let go of the superiority and inferiority, which is really tough, because we've been conditioned into a power under dynamic. So to really empower ourselves, we need to also see the power in others.
To even get at one of these beliefs that people hold, like when you say that and you say that you realized one end of the stick was understanding that you felt inferior and the other end of the stick is understanding that other people felt superior to you, how did you even come to recognize that? Like, what kinds of questions can we ask to
Mm.
gain perspective on what that underlying belief is?
Mm. There's so many ways. I think therapy is a great option, for a lot of people, especially if you've never explored it. I think, a lot of people say like, oh, but I can talk to my friends about anything. And it's great, right? Having people that you can talk to and that you can take your masks off with is absolutely important. We want to have a supportive community, and it hits differently if you have someone who's trained professionally, right, has the skills, has the tools and the resources to really support you through that. And someone, I will say, knowing I was like paying my therapist and this could be one sided, it wasn't like, oh, we have to do the back and forth. Now I have to support you. I could just talk about whatever was coming up for me. That has been incredibly helpful. So I think having a therapist or a coach, someone in a professional capacity to really ask us those questions, right? Just as you think about if you've never ever been to the gym before, you might walk into a gym and feel incredibly overwhelmed, right? All of the weights, all of the equipment, it's all there to help you, but you don't know what you don't know. And so if you've never worked out before, you might start going to some classes and learning from instructors. You might hire a personal trainer. And so I think of it much the same way, finding someone with whom you resonate, with whom you feel safe. That's really, really key and important. Who you feel safe to take that mask off with, to, kind of look through the things in the closet that maybe have been in the dark for quite a long time. Because I think the I'd say the worst thing people can do is assume that they're alone in what they're experiencing, that no one's ever been in those positions or felt those things. And so oftentimes we hide it because we think, oh gosh, people are going to think I'm weird or I'm going to be outcast or whatever it is. And so I would say, first and foremost, if you have no experience, I would say find someone to support you in a professional capacity so you start to learn those tools. If that's inaccessible or doesn't feel good, there's so many books out there on, let's say, coaching, right? If you like, coactive coaching is the first book that comes to mind that I really love. Within the coactive coaching book, it's a book designed to help you become a coach, but you don't have to become a professional coach. You can become your own coach. And there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of examples, there are a lot of coaches online who offer free content. I'm one of them. But there are a lot of people, depending on whose message you really resonate with, who offer a ton of free resources and tools to help you learn the things that you don't yet know.
I know I've had my own journey with therapy, and it took a few. Like, people have to understand if they're new to it and they haven't done it before and there's some reluctancy that comes up. It is a little bit like dating, where you do kind of have to find the right one, and sometimes that does take a commitment of maybe like 4 to 6 sessions or however many until you feel it out. At this point, I've been working with my therapist, my current therapist, for like 3 years. The shit that she says to me sometimes, I'm like, oh, you are worth every penny. And I understand that's not an option for everybody financially. And I
Mhm.
myself, I'm only on like a once a month schedule with her right now. It's kind of maintenance. But even still, because I've been working with her for so long, when you said like holds a mirror up to you, holy cow, she will say something to me that I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that's where that was coming from. And she refers to it. She told me one time, she goes, Galina, your house is a vibe. It's super cute. It's decorated well. Everything's neat and organized. But when you come in here and you talk to me, we're looking in the basement, and the basement is dark and grim and dusty. And she just had that keen ability, because she'd gotten to know me so well and is such a brilliant therapist, that she was able to look in spaces just based on what I was saying and knowing my history that like I kind of couldn't get to by myself, unfortunately. I think it is critical to get some kind of feedback from somewhere. And, maybe it doesn't have to cost money. Maybe it can be looking like working with other coaches or working with mentors or finding like a 12-step program or something where you can have feedback. Because I think in our own heads, like, we don't know what we don't know. It's exactly what you said about the gym.
Absolutely. I think for me, I would say the most important thing is not only someone you feel safe with, but also someone who embodies what they're preaching, right? Because I think there can be that gap too, where people have a lot of cognitive awareness because they've studied, they've read the books, they've done the courses, whatever it is. But when someone embodies in a way that really inspires you to say, oh, I want to show up more like that person, I want to understand more, then that can be really great. Because I've had, to your point, it can be like dating. I've had therapists where I'm like, you don't really seem to be getting what I'm saying here. You don't seem to get it because, and I had a coach years ago who said this, like, we can't guide people to walk through doorways we haven't walked through ourselves. So if I'm trying to go deeper within myself and I'm talking to someone who hasn't walked through those doorways themselves, then it's really hard for them to support me in that depth. And so it sounds like your therapist can sit with you in your dusty basement because she's also taking care of her own basement.
Absolutely. What got you into wanting to work with self-awareness and the modalities that you're into?
Doing it really poorly for a long time in myself. I'll say that. I think there's this phrase, we become the person that we needed on our journey. And for a long time, going back to this idea of the gap between cognitive awareness and embodied awareness, a lot of people might hear that and then start to judge themselves of like, oh, I'm not following through, I'm not doing this enough. The way I reframed that for myself was, it's like packing for a trip. I just hiked Kilimanjaro last year, and I remember as I was preparing for that trip, there's a huge packing list of like, okay, I need to collect all of these things, right? I need these supplies and these materials. And I felt that way on my journey when I was reading all of the books, taking the classes, and accumulating a lot of that cognitive awareness and knowledge. I was finally prepared to go on the journey itself. But I think it's really important to recognize that like buying the supplies on the supply list is not the same thing as hiking Kilimanjaro, right? And so we need to understand, like, reading a book on how to ride a bicycle is not the same as riding the bicycle. And so I think that for me, my own journey to embodiment was a very long, hard, and dark path. I looked into a lot of really dark spaces in my own basement, and it felt very lonely, very isolating, very dark at times. And, this is years after I started coaching. I started out as career coaching and doing a lot of the self awareness. But I think now, with where I am on the journey, I don't want anyone to feel alone in that work. I say that everyone has to walk their own path, but you don't have to walk the path alone. And so, what I'm really passionate about is not doing it for people, right? Not fixing anything, because I believe everyone is perfect and beautiful the way that they are. And if you're getting the data from your emotions, from your body, that you want to move in a direction, you want to change something about your life or how you're showing up, beautiful, right? That's what life is all about. It's change, it's opportunity, it's playing the game. And so I do this work not because I think anyone needs to get fixed or they're broken or anything like this. It's, I want to love people. I want to love expansively. I want to create containers of safety, because we live in a world of chronic dysregulation, where if we, talk about evolution for a moment, this idea that we have these predators coming at us and then it activates like our fight or flight. We're meant to get out of that moment of danger so that we can kind of shake it off and then regulate. But these days, our brain has convinced us, and oftentimes it's very true, so that's not a way to invalidate what we're feeling, but we have predators around every corner. Our boss, is constantly trying to ask us for things or criticizing us. Our partner maybe is criticizing us, and it feels like we can't catch a break. And I believe that we can't do any of this work to get curious, to unpack, to learn how to move forward in our lives if we're just fighting for survival. So I'm really passionate about creating containers where people can take a breath. They can say, oh, wow, I am carrying a lot. I am holding a lot. There is a lot going on in my life that's dysregulating me or making me feel unsafe. So how can I feel safe enough in this moment to figure out what I want to do about it? Not to change my whole life around necessarily, but just to take one step forward to feeling a little more safe, a little more loved. So that's really where I'm passionate.
Beautifully put. What do you
Thanks.
say to people who are always catastrophizing?
How is that serving you?
Yes.
It's a great question, because twofold. One, because oftentimes it'll interrupt people and they'll say, wow, you're right. It's not really serving me to catastrophize, to, kind of play this role of Chicken Little, like the sky's always falling. But then there's also the nuance of it is serving in some way, because our brains are very lazy. Um, you know, again, tapping back into the idea of evolution, when resources were really scarce, like we needed to conserve energy. So our brain doesn't do things because it's just fun to do it. If we're constantly catastrophizing, and our brain is like the most energy consuming organ in our body, like 20% of our energy goes to brain function. And so if we're constantly ruminating and spinning on a story, there's a reason that's happening. And that could be, let's say, if someone is embodying the victim mindset, that woe is me, or I don't have any power in this situation, constantly catastrophizing helps your ego feel right. And it's a protection mechanism, right? Because our ego is trying to keep us safe. We tend to villainize the ego these days, but I like to think of the ego as like the safe older brother, right? Who's looking out for me. But if we have an ego that's going unchecked, it can feel a lot more like the overprotective dad who's like sitting on the porch with a shotgun, and that doesn't really feel good. But it's because they're so afraid. They're so worried about, their little girl, or, their kid in that situation. But if we can really work with our ego to say, okay, you can trust me. I am capable. I have what it takes. We can really nurture our ego into being that like safer older brother. And so I think that, going back to this idea of the ego, right? If we are embodying that victim mindset, and oftentimes it comes from, an adaptive strategy from childhood. I was in this mindset very much, this chronic power under victim mindset, because as a kid, I needed to embody that mindset in order to survive my childhood. So again, it's about letting go of the judgment, because embodying that mindset did serve me as a kid. It helped me survive and get into adulthood. But just as we outgrow our clothing, and to continue wearing a jacket that's 2 sizes too small can feel restrictive and feel really uncomfortable, at some point we need to be willing to take the jacket off. And so if we're embodying the victim mindset, our ego it's that jacket, right? Of like, but this worked before, it's worked for so long. And so getting curious helps us understand, oh, the catastrophizing is keeping me in the status quo. It's keeping me right where I am. And if that's not serving me, if it's causing complete anxiety, panic attacks, depression, whatever it is, how do I get curious about why I'm still catastrophizing? And am I willing to let go of those stories?
You often hear people say, oh, I need to slow down. I know I need to slow down. I'm overwhelmed. You should see my to-do list, blah, blah, blah. And we are in this society of, I think, glorifying overwhelm, and that it's a way to brag. Maybe it's like a self-defense mechanism, or just a way to feel like, as a person who put so much of my self-worth in productivity, like I was and still to an extent am this person that's like, well, look at how much I just got done. Walk me through intention to slow down to actually implementing slowing down.
Mm. Mm, I think you nailed it on the head. This story, this glorification of busyness, of overwhelm, of I only slept 4 hours last night. Look at me, I'm so busy. Um, but I think you also said it right. When we attach our self-worth to our to-do list, that's where it really comes in, and it can get to a place where it doesn't serve us, because we adopt this story. If I just do a little more, if I just do enough, then I'll be enough. But if you stop to ask yourself, when will it be enough, right? Again, this curiosity you'll sense is a theme of mine. Uh, when will it be enough, right? Instead of just constantly on that hamster wheel of I have to do more to be more, do more to be more. If we can insert like a break for just a second, which doesn't take very long, to just say, when will it be enough? And how will I know when I've gotten there? A lot of times that's enough to stump us and say, oh my gosh, it's never going to be enough. I'm going to be doing this until I run myself right into my grave. And so I think part of it is that pattern interruption through curiosity and asking those questions. I think some of it is also looking at our environment. We hear the comment of like we're the average of the 5 people we spend the most time with. And if I'm constantly around people who are hustling for their worthiness, who are constantly busy, that can feel really uncomfortable, a threat to our belonging, a threat to our community, to think, oh, I'm going to go slow down. I'm going to go to a retreat. I'm going to go to a spa day. I'm going to go meditate, whatever it is. And so I think there's an intention of, and it's a little chicken and egg, right? Because we
Mhm.
need to slow down enough to get curious, which doesn't take a whole lot of time, but we need to insert a wedge. Because if we're just constantly on the hamster wheel or the treadmill, we're not willing to stop or do something different. If nothing changes, nothing changes. So there has to be some sort of willingness, some sort of intention to slow down. And so I like to use that analogy of the wedge. For me, my recommendation is like a 5-minute meditation where we just give ourselves permission to let the to-do list be there when we're done in 5 minutes, and just allow ourselves to be. And we start to breathe into it, maybe start to get curious about what we're feeling in our bodies, because if we live in our heads, oftentimes we have no idea what we're feeling in our bodies. So getting curious about the information, the data, what am I feeling? A great exercise that can be used is the 5 senses. If we want to slow down, what am I seeing, right? We can look around the room. What am I smelling? What am I hearing right now? What am I feeling, right, with my fingers? What am I tasting in my mouth? We can really start to activate our senses as a way to ground us in the present moment. And then just start to notice, wow, how does this feel? I feel like my shoulders are resting. I feel a little lighter. I feel calmer already. It really doesn't take that long. A lot of times we might think, oh gosh, I have to go meditate for a whole hour to feel better. And that is what feels insurmountable, because when am I going to carve out a whole hour? But it really just takes a few minutes. And as we start to notice and then reflect on how that felt, for me anyway, when I started my daily meditation practice about 2.5 years ago, I started with like 5 minutes a day. And now I like look forward to it. I'm like, how much time can I carve out for my meditation? Because it's such a juicy gift that I get to give myself. And I've drastically slowed down in a lot of ways. And rather than buying into the story that everything's going to be terrible, my life's going to go to crap, I'm not going to accomplish anything, my life is now more successful, more fulfilling, more joyful than ever before. And I'm doing a lot less than I ever have.
It's so relaxing to hear that. I mean that word and up again, but I mean just the 5 senses, right? Like that's such an easy implementation that honestly 10 seconds actually just to come into your body and do that. That really doesn't take that long and it's really easy to remember. So that's going to be super useful. I wanted to talk to you about because I know you studied Carl Jung and
Hmm.
what you've taken away from that, and maybe we can talk about the 9 pillars of individuation because I don't really know a lot about that, but I'm very curious.
Yeah, I love it. Most people know Carl Jung as, a psychologist from the 20th century. You usually hear Jung and Freud in sort of the same context, but I really was attracted to his research because he does work on individuation, which is, according to his term, this idea of like whole person integration. And so Jung talks a lot about integrating the shadow and working with the unconscious. He did a lot with dream interpretation and really trying to tap into the subconscious and the unconscious. And when I was in grad school a few years ago, I had already been doing a lot of this work, this like introspective, contemplative work. And so a lot of what I was reading in the literature resonated with me. But I remember what it was like to be on the other side of that work. And I was like, what the heck does this mean? Like a lot of people, right? It feels very abstract, very conceptual. If you have no idea what shadow work is, how do you integrate your shadow? And so in my research, what I did is I undertook a qualitative research study using Daniel Goleman's principles of emotional intelligence as sort of an inspiration, where he has this umbrella topic of emotional intelligence. But then he, within it, talks about, self-awareness, relationship management, social awareness. And so I really went through and I articulated these 9 pillars of individuation, because what I want ultimately is to help create breadcrumbs for people to follow. So the 9 pillars are active practices and outcomes. So they are states and traits. So one that I'll use, for instance, self-awareness is a big one. That won't come as any surprise. But another one I'll speak to is resilience, for instance. And a lot of times people think about resilience in the sense of, oh, it means that I'm good at moving through adversity, right? Bouncing back from challenges. But oftentimes we tend to think or assume that at some point I'll become so resilient, I don't feel challenged anymore. And that is like saying, at some point I'll be strong enough that when I go to the gym, I can lift any weight without any struggle. And when you say it that way, thinking about our physical strength, people might chuckle even because it's like, well, that sounds silly. Like, no one can lift any amount of weight, right? But we often think about that, and that can lead to a lot of the judgment and belittling of ourselves when we enter into a situation and we think, oh gosh, I've already encountered this, or this story that I held on to is coming up again. I thought I was past this, right? Why am I still feeling this way? And so it's really about understanding that to cultivate resilience as part of who we are, we need to practice resilience just like we practice lifting weights or exercising in the gym. And as we do so, we become stronger, we become better. But the act of breaking those muscles down to make them stronger always feels the same, regardless of the amount of weight that we're lifting. It's just an opportunity to zoom out and say, oh, wow, I'm actually lifting a lot more weight now than what I was lifting in the past. And so with resilience, and there are things like taking responsibility for your life, creating appreciative acceptance for everything that happens, and ultimately finding presence and being present with everything that is in your life. It's really, I like to say, kind of a pathway to that integration and integrating all parts of ourselves, but in a way that's more tangible and accessible to, anyone who might want to practice it.
For someone that's never heard of shadow work, what is shadow work and how do we do it?
Yeah, there's so many ways to do shadow work. But really, going back to your beautiful analogy of the basement, right? Our shadow is really anything that somewhere along the way, usually as a very young child, when our brains are coming online and we're really looking out to the world to find signals of how do I belong? How do I fit in? How do I stay safe and earn love in this world? Let's say there's a trait that you have. I'll use myself as an example, right? Um, I'm a very outspoken and direct communicator. As a child, not always respected, not always valued. I was seen as someone who could talk back, right? Someone who was a little sassy. And so I received a lot of messages that I shouldn't be outspoken because that's too aggressive or it's not appreciated. And so I took that part of myself, the outspoken direct communicator, and I put her into the shadow, which is basically like locking her in the basement, right? Because what I said was, that part isn't valued. That part's not going to win you any friends. It's not going to earn you the approval of the people that you want and need to be loved by. So we're just going to put that part in the shadow, into the darkness, into the unconscious, because it's not worthy. It's not valuable in today's society. So shadow work, to do shadow work, is really about, you'll guess it, tapping into curiosity about what are those parts of myself that I deemed weren't worthy, that I deemed were too much or not enough or inappropriate or whatever judgmental terms we use for ourselves. And it's about being willing to say, you can come back out. You can come out of the dark. I want to see you. I want to love you. I want to integrate you back into this wholeness of who I am. Because ultimately, someone telling me I shouldn't be a direct communicator, I internalized that and started saying that message to myself over and over and over again. And so the willingness, if we're constantly looking outside of us to say, I just want to be loved, I just want to be accepted, I just want someone to value or to approve of me, we need to, and we can start to give that message to ourselves. I didn't find the level of acceptance and love outside of me that I now experience until I started to love and accept those parts of myself internally. So it's really about flipping the equation. Instead of, well, if someone outside of me loves me, then I'll start telling myself that I'm lovable. And we really need to flip that and say, I'm lovable. And then eventually our outsides catch up with our insides, and we start attracting people and situations because again, everybody's a mirror, right? Every situation is a mirror of how we're talking to ourselves, how we're interacting with ourselves in our internal world. So if we start to work on integrating that shadow, pulling parts of ourselves from the darkness back into the light, and we start to love and accept those parts of ourselves, then we'll start to see people outside of us say, wow, I'm so glad you're so outspoken and direct in your communication, because that's really valuable. And then I just pat myself on the shoulder. I'm like, good job, Carissa. But it's because I started doing that work and giving that message to myself first that's made all the difference.
Do you think that when something is part of our shadow, that it's, as you're saying, a suppressed part of your personality, but is it kind of doing its own thing, living in the subconscious where it's coming out in like a negative form and that's why it's there? Is it more like you have a trait that's kind of in a gray area, and instead of pathologizing it and having it come up and cause issues for you, maybe the recognition with it and the like quote unquote pulling it out of the shadow is the way to actually have it not also be an issue, like a part of your personality that is causing you trouble, if that makes sense?
Totally. Because I think we don't know what we don't know. And so I think the more we know all those parts of ourselves, the more awareness we have on what role they are playing in us. Because if we're just saying, ah, la, 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 I can't hear you, I can't see you, we're not acknowledging, then we have no idea what that part of us is doing. But then I also think, kind of going back to earlier, that comment of, if you're ignoring me and I'm going to start speaking louder, I'm going to raise my voice because I want to be heard. There are parts of ourselves that just because our conscious mind said, you don't deserve to be here, they're over here like, damn right, I deserve to be here. Like, how dare you put me in the shadow? And so that can really create a lot of internal tension. And so then we feel tension. We're pulled in different directions. If you ever think, like, I want to do this, but I should do this, and I feel torn and pulled in multiple directions, that internal tension is usually a sign that we're not giving due time to all parts of ourselves. And then if we ignore it, then yeah, that's the extreme example that comes to mind is like when we like lash out at a partner, for instance, where the pressure has been building because we're ignoring, because it's almost like trying to keep the door closed when like water is coming through and you start to see the water like coming through the cracks and you're trying to hold it back, but eventually the water just like breaks the door down. I think that can happen with parts of ourselves when it's like the energy is building and building and building, and they say, I will not be repressed any longer. And if we haven't done the work to slowly open the door and create the pathway for the water to flow in a way that's really healthy and serves us in the way that we want it to show up, then it can become that tsunami and it can destroy everything.
Yeah, that makes me think. For me, I think part of my own shadow work has been neediness, that I was very afraid of coming off as needy. And what that turned into was then the extra suppression, which, as you're saying, kind of led into, oh my God, I'm being ignored by all these people. I'm not having my needs met. Well, because I'm not expressing them, because I decided expressing them was somehow terrible and made me unworthy. And so, yeah, you're right. It really is. It like builds up, anyways. If you try to shove it down, it's like all the more reason for it to fight against you. What's something that you know that you wish everybody knew about doing this kind of work?
Mm. Oh, I think I wish that people knew that it's all part of the game of life. It's not about a finish line. It truly is about the process, the destination, the journey itself. And I think there are so many aspects of our brains based on evolutionary biology, based on how we're equipped. There are a lot of aspects of ourselves and our brains that can keep us small and keep us stuck in these patterns, but they can also be the keys to our liberation. And I wish that more people knew that and knew how to use their tools to liberate themselves rather than keep themselves locked in a cage.
Amazing. Carissa Karban, if people want to work with you, where can they find more?
Ah, Thanks, Galina. This has been so wonderful. So I would say first check out the website, healcollective.me. That's where most of our information is on social, like on Instagram, healcollective.me, same handle. So you can find us there. Yeah, doing lots of really fun community oriented events where we're coming together. We're having these types of conversations. We're getting real. We're taking those masks off. We're holding each other in love and support, holding ourselves first and foremost. So would love for people to join the conversation and join the community.
Amazing. Thank you so much for doing the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
And thank you, everybody, for listening. Bye.